The studio lights were still warming when Blake Shelton took his seat on The View, flashing the familiar easy grin that had carried him through decades of interviews. He waved to the audience, soaking in the applause like second nature, tapping the desk playfully as if this were just another friendly chat. The hosts welcomed him warmly, trading light jokes about his music, his Oklahoma roots, and his reputation for saying whatever popped into his head. Blake leaned into it, relaxed, confident, tossing out one-liners that earned laughs and nods. It all felt predictable, safe. That confidence only grew when the conversation drifted toward fame and public expectations. Blake shrugged, smiling, and joked that he'd learned early on to just sing the songs and stay out of the rest. That was when Jane Fonda, seated across from him, tilted her head slightly. She hadn't interrupted. She hadn't reacted. She'd been listening. Her expression wasn't hostile, but it was focused, almost surgical. When she spoke, her voice was calm and steady, yet it carried enough weight to slice through the studio's casual energy. She asked him what he meant by staying out of it. Blake laughed lightly, assuming it was still banter, and said entertainers weren't politicians, that people tuned in to escape, not to be lectured. A few audience members chuckled, but the sound faded quickly. Jane didn't smile. She leaned forward just enough to shift the dynamic, eyes fixed on Blake. She asked whether silence from powerful voices was truly neutral, or whether it simply made life more comfortable for those already protected from consequences. The air changed instantly. The hosts glanced at one another, sensing the shift but saying nothing. Blake blinked, clearly caught off guard, then gave a half-smile and tried to deflect with humor. He joked that country singers got enough heat just choosing a guitar strap, drawing scattered laughter that felt thinner than before. Jane responded without raising her voice. She spoke about moments in history when artists, actors, and musicians were told the same thing: to stay quiet, to entertain, to avoid rocking the boat. As she spoke, the audience grew still. Blake adjusted in his chair, his knee bouncing slightly beneath the table. He tried to interject, but Jane held the floor with practiced grace, explaining that influence didn't require speeches or endorsements, sometimes it simply meant acknowledging reality. The camera cut to Blake's face, his grin fading into something tighter, more guarded. Blake finally jumped in, saying everyone should have the freedom to choose what they speak on and what they don't. His tone was firmer now, less playful. He emphasized personal choice, repeating the phrase as if anchoring himself to it. Jane nodded, letting him finish, then gently asked if that freedom felt the same for people without platforms, money, or protection. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. A soft murmur rippled through the audience. Blake opened his mouth to respond, then paused. He laughed again, but this time it sounded strained. He joked that he hadn't expected a philosophy class that morning. The laughter that followed was nervous, uneven. Jane didn't react to the joke. Instead, she spoke about mistakes she'd made earlier in her career, about times she'd chosen comfort over courage and regretted it later. Her honesty was disarming. The audience leaned in. Even the host sat still, hands folded, eyes locked on her. As Jane spoke, Blake's posture changed. His shoulders lowered, his hands clasped together on the table. He nodded occasionally, but his eyes darted toward the hosts, the audience, anywhere but Jane. When she finished, there was a brief silence before applause erupted, not explosive, but sustained and sincere. Blake forced a polite smile, nodding along, though the flush creeping up his neck betrayed his discomfort. The confident country star who'd walked out moments earlier now looked like a guest who'd wandered into a conversation he hadn't prepared for, realizing too late that charm alone wouldn't carry him through. When the applause finally faded, Blake cleared his throat and thanked Jane, his voice softer than before. He tried to regain footing, saying he respected her honesty and experience, but the words felt carefully measured, almost cautious. One of the hosts attempted to lighten the mood, steering the discussion back toward Blake's music and upcoming projects. For a moment, it seemed like the tension might dissolve. Blake smiled, nodded, even cracked a small joke about touring life. Yet the earlier exchange lingered in the room like unfinished business, and everyone could feel it. Jane hadn't retreated. She sat back, composed, hands folded, watching Blake with an expression that wasn't accusatory but expectant. When the host asked a follow-up about artists using their platforms responsibly, Jane re-entered the conversation, not forcefully, but firmly. She clarified that responsibility didn't mean perfection or constant activism, it meant awareness. She spoke about the power of acknowledgement, how even small moments of honesty could ripple outward. The audience responded again, applause rolling through the studio, stronger this time. Blake nodded along, but his smile flickered. He tried to counter by sharing a story from his early career, describing how backlash had once surprised him and how he learned to protect himself by keeping certain opinions private. His tone carried defensiveness now, though he framed it as self-preservation. Jane listened carefully, then asked a single, quiet question: whether protecting oneself should always come at the cost of speaking for others who couldn't. The simplicity of it hit harder than any accusation. For a split second, Blake looked genuinely unsure how to respond. The cameras lingered on his face, capturing the hesitation, the tightening jaw, the moment where confidence gave way to vulnerability. He admitted that he didn't have a perfect answer. The audience reacted with a mix of murmurs and nods, sensing the shift. Jane acknowledged his honesty, saying discomfort was often the first step toward growth. Her tone wasn't triumphant, it was reflective, almost gentle. The host stepped in again, sensing the segment nearing its breaking point. They thanked both guests for the passionate discussion and moved toward wrapping things up. But the damage, and the impact, had already been done. As the show cut to commercial, Blake leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply, rubbing his hands together as if trying to release the tension physically. Jane exchanged brief words with one of the hosts, smiling politely, completely at ease. Behind the scenes, staff members buzzed with quiet excitement. Producers whispered about how intense the exchange had been, already anticipating the reaction once clips hit social media. Blake stood up during the break, pacing slightly, his usual joking demeanor replaced by a thoughtful silence. When someone complimented him on handling a tough moment, he nodded but didn't smile. Jane, meanwhile, chatted calmly with crew members, thanking them, her presence steady and unshaken. When the show returned for final remarks, Blake's energy had changed. He was more subdued, choosing his words carefully, avoiding humor that might be misread. Jane offered a closing thought about dialogue, how disagreement didn't have to mean disrespect. The audience applauded warmly. Blake joined in, clapping along, his expression respectful but clearly humbled. Once the episode ended, the real storm began. Clips of the exchange flooded social media within minutes. Some praised Jane for her clarity and composure, calling the moment powerful and necessary. Others defended Blake, arguing he'd been put on the spot unfairly. But even among his supporters, many noticed the same thing: this wasn't Blake Shelton in control of the room. This was Blake Shelton being challenged, and visibly shaken. By the end of the day, headlines buzzed about the clash. Commentators dissected every pause, every glance, every nervous laugh. Blake released no immediate statement, choosing silence where he'd once joked. Jane, when asked later, simply said conversations like that mattered. The contrast spoke volumes. For Blake, the moment lingered longer than any interview mishap. It wasn't just about being disagreed with on live television, it was about being seen, unguarded, stripped of the humor he relied on. Jane had never raised her voice, never attacked him personally, yet the effect was unmistakable. In a room built for soundbites and smiles, she'd forced reflection. And as Blake walked away from the View that day, it was clear the clash hadn't ended on set, it had only just begun, echoing far beyond the studio walls.